Hey everybody, it's Matt Weaver with Bible Truth Project here with Joshua Waller, which is in Israel right now. Isn't
That's
that
right.
cool? What's a Southern boy doing in Israel?
Yeah,
I got to
that's a
hit you
great
with
question.
that. You know what I mean? It's just like
Yeah.
so random. It's good Southern drawl and everything. And in Israel,
Yeah.
you've lived there for almost 10 years now.
Yeah.
Actually, over
Yeah.
10
Well,
years.
yeah. Been working for first trip was 2005. So now living here, yeah, like you said, around 10 years, but back and forth before that.
Yeah. Well, I found out about you, or I should say your family and the ministry you guys started. It's probably been 8, 9 years ago. So my first trip to Israel was in 2011. And I want to say it was like 2012 or 2013 when I kind of found out about you guys. And back then, just vague, obviously, web page, some of the videos you guys put out, things like that. So that was kind of high fun. But I had never actually met you guys until this last time in Israel. I was up on Gerizim out Joseph's Lookout, looking out over Shechem, and up pulls two vans and out pops Josh and some of the Wallers. And I'm like, whoa, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
how
our
we
base of
met.
operations, you were close to home base because our
Yep.
base of operations for the work is actually here on the Mount of Blessing. So
Yep. And
you were close to.
that's basically from Gerizim. It's over kind of towards Nablus, but it's not down in the city, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. We're still on top of the mountain next to the Jewish community up here.
Okay. So how, I guess, tell us a little bit, how is it living in the territories, if you will? I mean, you have to say that correctly.
Correct.
You don't
Yeah.
want to call it the West Bank or
Living.
base.
Yeah. There we go. I would say, how is it living in the biblical heartland? How about
There
that?
you go. Biblical heartland. Perfect.
I mean, you were just mentioning Joseph. Literally, we're just next to where Joseph's buried. I mean, how in the world, growing up in Ohio like you or Tennessee like me, there's what do we have historically rooting us as Americans? Like, can you imagine being a Jewish person living next to a tomb of your father,
Yep.
Joseph? Unbelievable for
Right.
Jews that are living like you open your Bible and then all of a sudden you're like, and Joseph was buried in Shechem, right over there. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of years of history. If I'm looking out, I'm here on the Mount of Blessing now in my office here. If I'm looking out the window here, I can see the place where traditional tombs of Joshua and Caleb. Looking out this way, you have the traditional burial places of uh, Itamar and Eleazar in English, Aaron's sons, buried right. I mean, just incredible ancestry of this area. But yeah, for a Southern boy living here, it is a little bit. It took a little bit, but I came when I was 14 for the first time, and so coming out of the hills of Tennessee, we were organic farmers, conservative Christian family that just we were what you would describe as hardcore Zionist in our mindset. We loved Israel like crazy, and we just wanted to help somehow. We were kind of the opinion that there's this definition. People ask, "What is a Zionist?" And I like to tell them because you really have pro-Israel and then you have Zionists, right? Because there's a lot of pro-Israel people that say, they wave their flag and say it's, yeah, go Israel, go. And that's great. We need a lot of pro-Israel people in the world. But a Zionist is kind of what our family was. And it's like another step in that direction. It's literally where you jump out of the bleachers, where you're waving the flags, and you jump into the field and you grab the ball and you run with the team down and make the touchdown, right? So it's like the Zionist is wanted to be in the field, wanted to play the game. So my parents were those people who wanted to actually get in the game and be a part of building up the nation of Israel, wanted to be a part of seeing this miracle of the rebirth of Israel happen. And so that's how I ended up here at 14 years old with the ball running this Zionist dream down the field. I mean, and to me, it's a huge privilege after learning more of Israel, the history of Israel, our Christian past with Israel, and now today to be able to really bring a gift and an offering of repentance, really, to have Christians come in and bring a gift of love and a gift of a service to help build up the land of Israel. It's a huge blessing and honor to do that. So that's a little bit of a kickoff how I got here at starting at 14 years old.
Yeah, man, that's not fair.
I know. Yeah, but I don't know.
Man.
Most people, maybe some people would be jealous, but I'm not sure how many actually.
Yeah, probably not too many. I am an oddball. Most people are like, oh, that's that Israel nut, that crazy guy.
Yeah, right.
Like,
Raised in the biblical heartland of Israel. There you go. There's the terminology, biblical heartland.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I've spent a decent amount of time over in the region, et cetera, and driving through the biblical heartland, et cetera. And it's a special place because most of the Bible stories really happen in Judea and Samaria. Yeah, of course, Galilee and some of this stuff, but especially Old Testament, you have, or however you want to terminate it. So Hebrew Bible, First Testament, Old Testament.
I did heard somebody recently called it the original Testament.
Original Testament. Cool.
Original Testament. I'm like, well, hey, that's really, and then they called the Newer Testament. I was like, hey, I like that theology.
Yeah.
That's really,
it's one of those things that unless you're familiar, and I don't say this in a condescending way. I remember before I went the first time, I kind of resented. I mean, I had an uncle and my dad and or my parents came to Israel before we were there, and they would talk about, oh, you need to go, it'll change everything, blah 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 blah. And I almost resented that a little bit. It's like, oh, come on. I mean, I'm a good Christian. What do you mean? Like, you don't need to know all that stuff, etc. And man, did that change when I got my feet on the ground, because it's just, there's something about it, and I've listened to different people try to explain it, but it's kind of unexplainable. There's this draw. It just kind of pulls you in, right? And then you're faced with some dilemmas and it's not anything new. Everybody that loves Israel has to deal with it. There's these issues of how to love the Jewish people, how to deal with some of the theological differences between the two family groups, if you will. I don't know how you guys look at it, but for myself, I look at it as Christianity and Judaism, as we know it today, rabbinic Judaism, both came out of the Second Temple period. And not necessarily us as Gentiles, but our faith did. And there's so much that we share. There's so many values we share. There's so much that we have in common. And there are differences. There are some major ones, obviously, believing in Messiah, etc. So those are some of the things that that journey of moving through that and understanding, kind of understanding God's heart for Israel in general. I know my position, but I'm curious about your position. Why do you still think that God cares about Israel?
Yeah, no, I love that. I love your approach. Very similar. I believe that when we tell people that God's the same today, yesterday, today, and forever, and then we follow up with that, except for the fact that God chose Christianity now and forgot the Jews. It's like it doesn't flow, right? And so when we say that, we lose all credibility. And a lot of people, are cool with that. And as long as you can call yourself Christian and be fine with the fact that God actually decided to change, then, but there's a big problem with that theology. So for me, realizing that God is the same today, yesterday, today, and forever. He made a covenant with the Jewish people that was even. If you wanted to take even Christian theology, it all makes sense. A lot of people are saying, well, how do we make sense of this? Well, even Paul himself, very clear about this in Romans 11, of the how the Jewish people, they're not forgotten. God made an eternal covenant, and it still stands today. And so, I think it's one of our duties in Christianity to keep Christians on target. And I think there's fallow ground in the world, and there always has been. I just jumped out of our studio where we recorded a whole thing based on the world calls Jews, constantly is calling the Jews illegal. Everything a Jew does is illegal. I mean, you go from every look back in Jewish history since, you mentioned 2,000 years ago, the destruction of the Second Temple. Since that time, it's been one thing, attack after the Jews, after the other, that's the other. And every time, from the Ottomans now, and more recent to the British, illegal. Jews can't come into the land. They can't settle. And the settlements, you see settlements being the biggest issue, right? And so attack against God's people has been just atrocious over the years. And that's been from miseducation. People didn't understand the fact that God was unchangeable and that God made an everlasting promise. I mean, if we were talking about the geographical area that I'm standing in right now, we just jumped one hill over here. We're at Alon Moray, where God promised Abraham, he said, to you and your descendants, Genesis 12, to you and your descendants, I'll give this land. So as Christians, do we actually believe the Bible as a literal book? Or are we looking at it as some sort of mystical, hypothetical, in the clouds religion? And I guess for you and I, we're a little more tangible. I mean, like farmers, people from the countryside, right? I think just digging into the tangible reality, I'll speak for myself, of the literal, God's literal biblical, the tangible realities of our faith. I think for 2,000 years, the land of Israel not being here was really hard, and it allowed our faith to take a real mystic and just totally disconnected from any kind of realities on the ground. And what you described is coming to Israel and just having those light bulb aha moments constantly. I think it's because it's literally where the whole Bible is founded here, and it's like we've taken it away from this place for so long that now when you actually come and put your feet here, it's everything just begins to click again. It's like, whoa, God's real. He spoke and it happened, and this is where it happened. And then this story and that story and Abraham and the promise here, God made a promise and it's still valid today, even though the UN says that it's not. It's just the latest attack against God, fighting the Jewish people. So maybe a long answer to the story, but I still believe that God has a promise to the Jewish people, and he still holds it tightly. That God never forgets his promise to his people, and we can be a part of that. And that's where my Zionism comes from. I believe in Israel. I believe in the promises to Israel, and I believe that when in Amos it says you will again settle, never to be pulled up again from the land that I've promised to you, that it's going to happen, that Israel will return to the land and be settled here. And that also feels it, because I believe God's promises are still valid to his people Israel, that haven't changed. So that's my my connection to this country. And I really believe that every Christian should also share that deep faith and support for Israel based on a biblical foundation of support. I think it's vital for.
Yeah,
I saw this too, Matthew, just to say, the question is great, because just now in the big world, Gab, I think it's called, there's this huge war going on now where they're saying, attacking Israel, basically saying that Christians shouldn't have anything to do with Israel. We didn't start at the same place. And so just to set the record straight, great question. And yes, we do have a lot in common with this land of Israel and the Jewish people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from a fairly conservative background. My parents were actually from the Amish, so very conservative oriented people. They left the Amish before I was born, but still retained a lot of more conservative type culture, etc. And I can appreciate that culture in a way that a lot of modern, liberal evangelicals can't. They look at that and what's with all the religious rigor, and they have this allergy to legalism, and they wrap that in their theology against the law, etc. And it's a big conversation, obviously, even amongst Jews. And that's something that's interesting that a lot of people don't recognize, is the amount of conversation they have in the same fields, but just kind of a different application. I remember one time I was down with a rabbi friend of mine down in Gush Etzion, and he took us into the yeshiva there, and we were just watching them kind of do their studies, etc. And then some of the comments, and then we went out and we had lunch, and we were just talking about some of the things that what they're discussing and debating. I had to laugh a little bit, because coming from like that Amish world, if you will, they have a lot of the same. Okay, they're not theologically deep necessarily, but they have a lot of the same, like, okay, we have to like wrestle with this now. They're not basing it on God's law, but let's say it's an issue of technology. Well, should we adapt this technology or should we not adapt this technology? Well, how can we do this? Okay, you can have a phone, but you got to leave it out in the. I just had to laugh because I'm like, it's just similar things going on. Obviously, completely different. Um, it's you're talking man's laws versus God's laws, but still very similar approach. And so the
Yeah.
culture to me feels very familiar. You know, especially the Orthodox world, it feels connectable, it feels familiar, or even the conservative world for that matter. But anyway, so and that's just a weird quirk for me from my background. You know, there's people that come in and they look at that and they just, you know, that they just it just doesn't make any sense. You know, Jesus is the end of the law, they would say, and blah 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 blah. That's a whole other theological discussion. But at the end of the day, what really struck me the first time I went into Jerusalem and down the Western Walls, watching what goes on down there. What really hit me was that the dedication, the sincerity, um, how'd you say it? Far more than myself and the world that I grew up in. You know,
Yeah.
yeah, we were dedicated believers and Christians and all that, but wow, they took God's word seriously, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that ties into, you know, settling the land again because God said it's their possession forever based on the
Yeah.
promise he made with Abraham, which kind of brings up another point. And in the regional conflict, and obviously a lot of people from the West don't know all the history. There's a lot of history there. You know, there's thousands of years of history. There's always been a Jewish presence in the land.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then you come into the 19th century or the 19th century, and you know, Zionism kind of comes to the surface, and then you have the world wars, and now you have this mass migration, and ultimately 48 and then 67, the two big kind of nation shaping conflicts
Yeah.
that they've had. And now we live in this this culture, I guess, of conflict in Israel, and the world kind of doesn't know what to do with it. And
Yeah.
I look at that and I see prophetic implications. You know, this is
Yeah.
part of the prophetic blueprint. And yet at the same time, you know, I know some Palestinians, and you feel bad in one sense, but you don't feel bad in another sense, and it's kind of hard to to marry all the ideas together because it's kind of like, well, sorry, you know, God made this promise. Oops. But you live in the
Yeah.
middle of it. So I really am curious, what are your thoughts? I mean, I heard some of your thoughts when we were up there, you were talking to your group, but what are your
Yeah.
thoughts? I mean, you literally live Jewish community, Samaritan community, and Palestinian right on the base of the mountain. So you deal with this every day. What's your perspective?
Yeah, well, it's a great question because it literally is what the world is all trying to figure out. They're trying to come up with a solution for a Jewish problem, and that's where they it sounds horrible, right? But this is
Yeah.
literally what the world is consumed with. We spoke about like the historical buildup earlier about Jews being illegal, and how you can't be a settler, and that's been ever since the 1800s. Well, it's also true the whole buildup here of trying to the modern right now, right? So Jewish people are trying to settle, and there's a whole world against it. Just evil world that's trying to come against it. For me, again, it really goes back to that deep faith in knowing that God does have a plan, and when you look at it from a biblical perspective, for us, it really does go back to Abraham saying, like you said, God made a promise. Sorry, neighbors. But then it's bigger than that, and you almost have to have, as long as you're looking at this whole situation here with like some sort of a political genius, and you think you could figure out and come up with a solution for this problem, it's going to end in bloodshed every time. I mean, you look at it, the solutions that the world brings to a Jewish problem are never going to be solved until the world sees the Jews as not a problem. That's actually the solving. It's no longer a problem, right? Is when the world recognizes Israel as no longer a problem. Like that's actually the solution. Is the world looking at Israel as like the answer? And that's a deep concept, but really that's our whole Bible speaks of it. That Jerusalem would be a praise in all the earth, that Israel would become this light unto the nations. Like literally, this is what our Bible speak of it happening. And so I believe we could bring it down to like nitty gritty politics, but the situation on the ground here and the biblical context of Philistines attacking Israel was from a biblical perspective, would be driving the people of God towards God, right? Like that was a biblical narrative that God said in Deuteronomy. I believe that there'll be a thorn in your side, and all throughout the scriptures, you see this, like the attacks against Israel that drove Israel towards God. We wouldn't write the story that way. It wouldn't be, we're not God, but it seems like this is the context. And right now in Israel, we're seeing a massive return to God, like in a Jewish context. So for example, maybe we could say to God and conservative values. Maybe that'd be a way to say it. So I believe what's happening is you're having a new generation of people that's rising up. If you look at the conservative religious parties in the government, you have a good 60 something percent of the young people are voting conservative, 65%. So, and then the older folks at 65% are voting leftist, which is totally opposite of anywhere else in the world. So, and then that brings us to a prophecy in Ezekiel that says, when you come back to the land, I'll sprinkle clean water on you. So we could see that being represented literally in the elections in Israel. The young people are voting more and more and more conservative. So what comes with those conservative values is an understanding of the promises of God. Most of these conservatives are becoming more religious in their understandings of God and the land, the promises, which is driving them more to understand, wait, we can't be overrun by hostile enemies that are trying to kill us. We need to protect ourselves. And so I don't know what the end result of this is going to be, but I know that if we look at history again, God shows up, and the enemies of Israel, it's not a good thing. They got a bad day ahead of them. And that's just, what leftist world says, oh, how can you say that? But it's just the fact. The God haters and the Jew haters are really in the same category. If you want to fight God in a real physical, tangible way, go punch a Jew. Like that's literally how you do it these days. You want to fight God, go fight the Jews. Hitler did it, and every other, it's one of the greatest attacks against God is to fight his people. And we see that pretty well throughout history. This is the go. So peace in the Middle East. It's going to happen as God sprinkles clean water on the nation of Israel, as the people of Israel begin to recognize more and more of their God-given role of being a light to the nations, as they walk into this place. And also we have a role in it too. And I love this because in the Psalms, one of the Psalms of Ascent, Psalm 20-something, 120-something, talks about the nations. The nations will say, God has done great things for you. And then Israel responds, King David writes this in the Psalms, is that Israel responds to the nations saying that God has done great things for you. And then Israel says, God has done great things for us, which is a really great concept, because then that all of a sudden gives you and me a role to play in the job. We're supposed to come to Israel and say, hey, guess what? Hey, man, I know you've been like in this real thick of it, and you've been blinded by like constant pressure and people telling you need to lay down and we need to walk over you for 2,000 years. But God's done great things for you. And then it's like they stand up and they say, yeah, that's right. God has done great things for us. And then they take possession of this land and what the fullness of God's promises are. So yeah, it's a complicated question, and living smack in the middle of it. Yeah, I've gone into Arab villages a lot. I don't do it so much anymore because I have a advocacy channel. And I think they might have picked up on it a little bit. I got my window busted out a couple of months ago. So it's like, this is probably not the safest thing to do. It's a very hostile Arab culture inside of those villages. So inside of Israel and inside the Jewish communities of Judea and Samaria, the heartland, biblical heartland, it's great areas to be in. The IDF is really, really super great in these areas, and it's not dangerous. But the enemies of Israel will be utterly obliterated at some day and time. They're going to be cast out of this land. It's not always going to be the situation. Israel will prevail in the end, and there'll be peace. that's kind of that's the end of the end of the story. Is we're not going to have the situation forever, and hopefully it won't be that long before these hostile enemies are taken out. It's really not acceptable.
And another question would be, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. It's not related to that, but obviously you're Christian, so you believe in Jesus, and I'm curious, like your experiences in interacting with Jewish people. I mean, to me, most of them have always been very cordial and courteous, etc.
Yeah.
Obviously, they put a kind of a wall there. You know, your religion, my religion.
Yeah.
But but I'm just curious, living there amongst Jewish people as a believer, how does that work in general? I mean, have you seen changes in your neighbors as they realize you're, if you will, one of them, or not, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is when you come from the Jewish side of 2,000 years of persecution, and then I don't even know how they do it. Honestly, if I was Jewish, I don't understand how they would have allowed me to come serve them. Like, can you imagine that? It's somebody that has a 2,000 year, basically, like evil history. I mean, we've had a horrible, I mean,
Right.
pogrom after pogrom, massacre after this and that.
Right.
Even the Holocaust has its tinges of Christian influence, and then not just tinges. I mean, the early stuff is
Protestant. Yeah,
made a lot
absolutely.
of Christian, preparation, pushing in that direction. So for a Jewish person to be like, to be acceptant of me to come and serve here in the farms. We're farmers, we're helping build up the land here. If they're going to accept that, you got to realize how big of a deal that is. Like, people that, I mean, just came out of the Holocaust. Most people here in Israel have relatives of people that either, I mean, obviously they had relatives that survived in order to be here. So, like, but they came through that horror, right?
Right.
So I think that's the backdrop for understanding of that, and seeing just the fact of the grace that the Jewish people have to allow us to be here and serve is a huge, huge gift. And to be a part of it, because I think a lot of Christians come into Israel thinking that they're coming to, give something, bring some inspiration, do some sort of, bring something to the Jewish people, to teach or something like that. But in reality, as we come to Israel, it's like Israel itself is, and the Jewish people have so much that they're giving, and it's like it's drawing us in much, like we're understanding so much deeper of all these years of separation, that we didn't realize the relationship that was being missed. We didn't realize that there was a huge missing when you don't have Israel in the conversation. You don't have Israel you're reading the Bible and you don't have Israel there. You don't have a tangible reality of what that could look like. You don't have a Jewish people. I mean, the whole context of we spoke about the Newer Testament. The whole context of it is Jewish. Without Jewish people, how do you going to know what we've been so farly removed from that? So I think that having Jewish friends, having a lot of Jewish friends, and being accepted as a player. I'll tell you this: when we started the work here, obviously we weren't accepted around the communities. It wasn't something that was like the latest and greatest thing. It just wasn't, right? But over time and work and commitment to just serve and be a part. We're not here to evangelize. We're not here to do that. We're just here to serve and be a blessing. And honestly, that's why. What else would you do once you recognize our history? You really, every Christian should serve the Jewish people with no strings attached, right? Let's leave all the motivations and different things, or just leave those and say, hey, we're incredibly sorry for the past, and we just want to help you. I'm a farmer. You need any help on your farm? We want to help you on your farm. There's no other reason why. We're just going to help you. So after 18 years now of serving, there's been families that were hostile to us at the beginning that now are like, hey, we're so sorry that we were against you guys at the beginning. We totally see that you guys are for us, and that you guys have you're very important to us. because there's a wave of anti-Semitism and Israel hatred out there, that you have a role of stopping and actually standing between us and that world of hatred. And every non-Jew that's Israel loving has a massive role and massive calling to actually stand in front of that massive wave and teach against all of these horrible things, and to be a bit of a breaker. We gotta keep the Jewish people from continuing to be abused and hurt by all these anti-Semitic things. So yeah, we've definitely there's been massive change in the relationship here from the beginning when we first started until now. Thank God, and it's mutual. Like, we've grown incredibly in our understanding of the Bible through a Jewish context, and I think for them it's like, wow, that there would be Christians. To them, it's like unbelievable that there'd be Christians that love them with no strings attached. When we became, they didn't even know that existed. That there would just be Christians that just wanted to serve and be a part of this biblical thing that's happening. The Jewish people coming back to the land of Israel and establishing the land like the prophets foretold. That there would be Christians that would agree with the prophetic words of Isaiah and Jeremiah, that you would plant vineyards and settle the land and make gardens and eat their fruit. They're like, wait, there's Christians out there that also read Isaiah and Jeremiah and actually think that this is important, that this should happen like they wrote it, and that it could happen. And thank God there actually is. We've had volunteering here, over 3,000 volunteers come through just within the last 10, 12 years, and from over 30 countries. So thank God there are people out there that are also agreeing with the promises of God and wanting to join the Jewish people. And something we agree on. I told you this the other day. It's great, Matt. He said, why don't we, everybody always talks about why we just have to agree to disagree. He said, why? Why don't we agree to agree sometime? And I thought, well, that's a great idea, because we have so many of the Jewish people we can agree on. Why, what other people group in the world do you walk up to and just immediately go to what you disagree about? it's really kind of insanity. You got to know that you're really kind of a messed up in the head. And that may be the first sign of a little bit of anti-Semitic history and a little backlog when you realize that. But really, who in the world would you go to and just pick a fight for the sake of picking a fight on what you disagree on? Go to Israel and talk about what you agree on, because we agree on like tons of stuff, like tons of things we agree on, built on that same foundation, right? So that was one little note that was great.
Yeah, it's a great way to look at it. I mean, it's very true. I mean, I know for myself, obviously, I think the first interaction I had with a Jewish person was back in, I don't know, probably 15, 16 years old. And we had in one of our companies, we did construction, et cetera. And we had a lumber broker who was from Cleveland, who was a Jewish guy. It's that nagging question. And I think it comes from because we read the Bible, right? And then you have this narrative, Jesus getting crucified. And then there's that big question mark. Why was he rejected? Right. And, that's just one of the first things you want to ask one is like, why, as though right. First and foremost, they weren't witness to the event. Right. And not only that, what I think we're so ignorant of, or at least I was, and I think a lot of believers are, is the history, the 2,000 years of history. Yeah. I mean, it was the first century, for the most part, believers and, the other parties of Jewish people met in synagogues. And it was then shortly, I think it was after the 120s, where they kicked the believers out of the synagogues. So think about that for a moment, though. For almost 100 years, yeah, we shared the same sacred spaces.
Right. Yeah.
We did eventually divide. There was eventually like, okay, this isn't going to work, right? But as a whole, all the founding members of our faith, were Jews, never stopped being Jewish. They all attended, all the religious festivals, feasts, etc. They did Judaism, which wasn't a term, but they did that. They never stopped doing that. And it's a hard pill to swallow for some people. And I always wondered, like for myself, and part of my journey of understanding how this whole dynamic works, I think there's so much to be said there's so much that crept in once
Yeah.
the temple was destroyed, once that system of worship was destroyed, Judaism itself kind of formulated in the way that it is, with its traditions and et cetera. And we kind of went our way with our traditions. And fundamental to the change in the church, if you will, was this concept that God had forsaken the Jewish people and his blessing was on us, right? The church. And that pride and arrogance just filtered through totally. I mean, to have that kind of a viewpoint, you have to completely reject probably 85% of scripture, right? So all the prophets, they're out the door.
Yeah.
What good is most of the Bible if that's your view, that God can reject a people for whatever reason? And it isn't true, and it isn't true to his covenants. And even at that, if you want to look at the prophetic new covenant, right? Its context was with Israel and Judah. So even at that, we as Gentiles are complete strangers. We're foreigners, like Paul says. We were alienated from everything. And it's a miracle that the Lord has opened the door to us to be a part of the story, which is what it is. The story's not finished. That's what I always tell people. If people want to say, God is done. I'm like, just wait. Story's not done. We'll
It's not over.
Just wait and you'll see. Is there a need for repentance? Everyone needs to repent, right? I think we all understand that. And people will always ask the question, well, what about Jesus? Well, it's a great question, but it's not, like you said, it's not the first question to go to.
And I think for the biggest thing on our part is to actually understand who is this Messiah that we believe in. The context, you have to come to Israel to understand who Yeshua, Jesus is. Because outside of that, like you said, when Yeshua was here and walked around Israel, it was Jewish. It was Jewish context. It was a Jewish synagogue, right? And so to actually get context for our faith, you have to like be willing to lay down the 2000, well, let's just say 1900 years. You said that first, but 150 years was in the synagogue. After that, basically we have this huge lineup of history that was a lot of rebellion and a lot of paganism and a lot of different things that were attached to and then wars and fighting. I think all this has got to come full circle, and there will be. I think that's the great thing of redemption. I work in a redemptive work. When you see land being restored that's been barren for 2,000 years, it's really a twofold thing. It's like you're able to be a one from the nations to come and partner with Israel in a redemptive work of the land. Well, there's a redemptive work happening in the people. Doesn't matter if you're Jewish or Christian, you could say that. It's happening here in the land of Israel, a redemptive work where God is bringing the people back. Israel is here. I mean, that's crazy that Israel even exists. It's like the greatest miracle of our time. And for Christians to get out of this humbug that they're in, this bubble of just, I don't know, maybe it's just built on all this religion, and just they stuck their heels in too deep in 1948 to be able to, whoa, this was an answer to the promises spoken of in the Bible. Like most of Christianity rejected that fact, and even today people don't, with placement theology that's so prevalent in the church, still not recognizing the fact that God chose this people and chose the land, and so therefore we're not being a part of it. And so what I believe is that Christians should be here in the droves, supporting Israel to settle the land. But in 1948, what was happening? What was the Christian world doing? They were like sitting back watching, right? Like the couch was the best spot to be, listening to the radio, and then later on the TV to see what was going on with Israel. That's not the approach. Like that's not what Christians are supposed to be doing. Jesus, Yeshua would have been very unimpressed with that kind of reaction. He even said that he didn't come to serve, to be served, right? To serve the nation of Israel, serve his brothers even. And so I think it's a mandate to serve the people of Israel, and that Christians should gather around this concept of coming and serving Israel as, like you said, the nations. We're the nations coming in, being a part of this incredible thing. And just the fact that we have the ability to be a part of it, to me, is the mercy of God. Can you imagine, you know, Yeshua's sitting there all this time watching all this horrible things happening against his people. And the Christians somehow think that he's okay with that. Like, no, like that's all. And then when you come to Jerusalem and you see Jerusalem built as it is, and then you have these, all of a sudden the Jewish mindset of it, this, the son of David sitting on the throne of David in Jerusalem, like you're talking about, this makes so much more sense. We're like, wait, there's actually a Jerusalem, there's actually a Temple Mount, and there one day is actually going to be a temple that's going to sit there where the son of David, the Messiah, and again, that's kind of where we agree with the Jewish people on the son of David,
Yep.
who's going to be the Messiah. As Christians, we put a name on it, but son of David, the Messiah, is going to sit in Jerusalem and rule and reign, right? And that's Jewish concept.
Yep.
So that we partner in that direction as the whole world fights against it is really a challenge and a vital part of our Christian faith, I believe.
Well, that you just
we're really
the way you worded it right there, the whole world fights against it. It's actually 100% true. You know, when you look at the culmination of the age, the whole direction that everything is going to, especially from our theology, is Jesus returning, but from a Jewish perspective, is Messiah coming, right? That is, we agree on that. Because we read the same scriptures, right? So, I mean, if you look at the prophets, everything's Israel related. I think what opened my eyes, I kind of avoided prophecy. I stayed away from it when I was young because, it was a lot of the Hal Lindsey, how'd you say it? Imminent return theology, bang, Jesus coming back. And it, I always got scared because end times and all that and the way that it was portrayed. And as when I went to Israel for the first time, it sparked this interest in like, oh, wait a minute. This is something very different than what I've gotten used to hearing, right? And so you dig into the prophets and you read about prophecy, it's like, oh, okay, this isn't like, I mean, yeah, it's apocalyptic in a sense because there's going to be a lot of things going on in the world, but it's not that stuff. it's ultimately it surrounds the Jewish people, it surrounds Jerusalem, and it is a reunification of all parties involved, if that makes sense. God's judgment.
I think that what scared us, and I've got a very similar upbringing as you. Actually grew up in an Amish community, and when you said that, I was like, oh, that's really cool. But I grew up in an Amish community I was there from 7 to 14, so really formative years in an Amish community, and then came to Israel. Had the same kind of approach to prophecy. And then coming here, though, seeing what's happening, it's like it's tangible. It's not scary. It's
right.
You're actually see it happening, because when Jeremiah said you will yet plant vines on the mountains of Samaria, that's not scary. That's not apocalyptic. That's just, you got to do that. And now that people are doing it, farmers came and just started planting vines in the mountains of Samaria. You're like, oh, that's prophecy. Like that's okay. I can handle that.
Right.
I can handle that. If the prophet was like, okay, that's not very scary. I just go to the barn and get a shovel and start playing. And literally, people are like, yeah, right. That's not what Jeremiah said. Well, it was like nothing here. The mountains were completely barren.
Right.
And then there's over 500 acres of vineyards here now. And it's just to a T what the prophet said would happen. And then when in Jewish thought, you're looking at it, it's certainly the fulfillment of what the prophet said. Like in Jewish thought, the vineyard, there's a reason why, like, the talk about the vineyard is incessant throughout all the prophets, because that's like the symbol of life and returning and good, right? So now that this is coming back, it's like obvious to Jewish people, this is a return of prophecy. Like God is remembering his words that he spoke to the holy prophets. Now Christians are missing it completely because we don't drink wine and we don't have anything to do with grapes. But we're like, wait, hold on. Are we sinking our heels in again, right?
Yeah.
Are we sinking our heels in again and refusing to be aware that the prophecies are actually happening in the land of Israel? Just like in 1948, when most of Christianity said, no, sorry, the Jews aren't it. It's just happenstance that they're returning back to their homeland after 2,000 years. I know it's never happened to anybody else, and it can't be God because we're it. And, no, that's called sinking your heels in and refusing believe at what God's doing. So even today, we have the same things happening. Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. Any Christian around the world that sees Jewish settlement as illegal under international pressure should look at that and just like, it should be like unacceptable. There's what, 2 billion Christians in the world? All of that force should be saying, that's ridiculous. International law, it's illegal for Jews to live in Judea. That's ridiculous. But yet, the Christian world, because we've been so off targeted, right? We've been so taken off the main track, are refusing to support and believe in the literal promises of God. So literally prophecy happening, it's no longer like a scary, like what's it gonna, it's actually a hope-filled thing,
Right.
that we know, because when you read it, it's like, no, it's happening in front of me every day. Like my wife and I, we get up in the morning, we love to just get up and just pray over the mountains of Israel. We're just sitting here right on top of this mountain. We can see Jerusalem from here. And literally we see it unfolding before us every day. Like it's just really simple things, like new settlements being built, more Jewish people moving into Israel, more Aliyah happening where they're making immigration to Israel. The world blows over those things as if they're the worst atrocity that's happening in the modern age. But yet it's the fulfillment of every word that was spoken by the prophets. And we have to recognize the times that we're living in. I think the biggest difference, and I'll throw it back to you in a second here, but the biggest difference between Christian prophecy and the Jewish understanding of prophecy is that the Jewish people look at it as like a to-do list, right? Like, oh, it says we're supposed to do, even the disciples, when they're looking at, oh, Yeshua, he's the Messiah, they're, did he do this? Like they're looking at, like he's the one that Moses spoke about, right? Nathaniel and the whole story. They're like, he's the one Moses spoke about. Okay, all right, he's it. They didn't just get under some sort of like spiritual, convulsion of some sort and like, oh, and this is it, right? No, they were like, no, this is the one that Moses spoke about. It's a fulfillment of the prophecy. It was a very tangible, physical thing. They were like, yes, this matches, this is it, right? And so even today, that's how a Jewish person would view prophecy. I was like, oh, here it is. It's a to-do list. Here we go. And we're right here. Now the next step. Let's keep settling. Let's keep more Jewish people need to be brought into the land of Israel. And so for us to partner with that, I think is an incredible approach to prophecy, and something that we can agree with the Jewish people on. And really, you could go a long way with that when you're partnering. One of the guys here, one of the Orthodox religious guys here next to where we live, he said we're partners in the redemption process. I thought, is that not the best way to put it? We're Christians, like can be partners with the Jewish people in this redemption process that's happening in the land of Israel. I mean, that's a huge honor to be a part of that. But for a Jewish person to say that is huge.
Yeah, it's incredible. So how can people connect to your ministry, etc.? I know you have trips that go over that do the harvest every year. You've got that coming up, I think, before too long, which I know it's full, but tell us a little bit about where they can connect.
Yeah. So what we wanted to do is we want to bring people in to one, serve the Jewish people. We want to, and we're basically have volunteer efforts going year round now. Harvest is one of the big things we do. But we're also doing the prunings, vineyards, olives, lots of pruning to be done here during the January season. We're harvesting all different kinds of stuff. We've done a huge now tree planting effort. We're trying to reforest massive parts of the biblical heartland. So we're doing that as well. So we have literally opportunities all around the year to come and be a part. The best way to get engaged with that is to go to serveisrael.com. Easiest link to remember, serveisrael.com, and just go to volunteer options. There's a whole list and calendar and different sheets, and then just sign up for a trip and meet us here, and we'll start serving together in whatever capacity it is, whatever the trip, the season, the time. But typically, yeah, we're working. It's a work trip. It's we're volunteering on different farms. It could be a night watch even for a farm that has, we have farmers here that have sheep stolen from time to time. Hey, if we can watch those farms and help be a part of the night watch for that, hey, that's a great way to partner with Israel. We don't need sheep being stolen off the mountains of Israel. That's and just a simple person sitting up and watching a farm, have a little campfire. It's great. Partnering with a small farmer that can't take his grapes in is a great way to stand with Israel. Putting a fence up around a farm that has deer, consuming their harvest because they're a small farmer, they can't do something. Taking equipment out. We have quite a lot of equipment now. Throwing a excavator on the back of a flatbed and running out and putting a water line in, for a farm that the water's too hot, the sheep can't even drink it. It's like these problems in the Middle East that you wouldn't think of in Ohio. Water too hot to drink through the pipe. Well, that happens. So what does a small farmer do? So those are the kind of things that we would, putting in a security road behind a facility that needs to be watched better, whatever that could be. And so that's a little bit of what our efforts are. But yeah, serveisrael.com is the best way to engage with it. And there at the website, lots of volunteer options. But we'd love to have conservatives across America, especially, we've had some conservative, even Mennonite Amish background come as well. Fantastic folks. Those people that are connected to the land make for amazing volunteers when it comes to serving and being part of building up the land. But yeah.
It's awesome. Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. It's been amazing having this conversation with you. So hopefully we can connect again. I'm planning, Lord willing, to be over next March again. So we'll see. Maybe we can connect. That'd be great. So
there we go. We look forward to it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Matthew.
Take care.
Yeah.